Newsline with Faraz Shaukat Ali.
Hello there, very good morning. It's the 1st of July 2016. This is Newsline. I'm Sonali Wanigabadake, and joining us this morning is one of the commissioners of the Human Rights Commission of Sri Lanka, Ambika Satkunanathan. Good morning, Ambika.
Good morning, Sonali.
Thanks so much for joining us this morning.
Thank you for having me on the show.
Now, last week, the International Day in support of victims of torture was marked, and I believe the Human Rights Commission of Sri Lanka also hosted an event in line with this. Can you just tell us a bit about it?
Yes, of course. We, the Human Rights Commission of Sri Lanka, we had an event yesterday, the 30th of June. It was a public march to raise awareness about torture. So the slogan was, let's stop and eradicate torture. We had the Minister of Law and Order, Ms. Sagala Ratnayaka, inaugurated the event, and we also had His Excellency the President joined us for part of the walk, and we had actually it was very good participation. We had school children, there was civil society, there were public servants. We also had the police and the military who joined us on the walk, as well as members of the clergy. Then the entire event, it culminated in a small meeting at the Independence Square, where we had a student, a youth leader, a torture victim, as well as a psychiatrist they addressed the audience. We also had students from the University of Caledonia who performed a very interesting piece of drama on torture so that was the event, and it was actually very successful.
Ambika, the Constitution of Sri Lanka provides that it is a fundamental right, the prevention of torture, inhuman, degrading treatment. As an attorney at law, can you define what are the elements of torture?
As you rightly said, Article 11 of the Constitution prohibits torture, and it protects all citizens from being subjected to torture, cruel or inhuman, degrading treatment. There are 4 elements of torture. So the torture, it has to be an act that causes severe pain or suffering. It has to be done with intention, intentionally, and also the intent should be to extract information or to intimidate, coerce, or as a form of discrimination. And of course there has to be an official element, so it has to be a state official who is involved in that act. So those are the 4 elements of torture.
Ambika, I'd like to talk about torture which may happen in the private domain as well later on in the conversation, but first I'd like to know, at the Human Rights Commission, do you get a lot of cases with regard to torture, and what's your work like when it comes to this element?
We do get a considerable number of complaints. So for instance, in 2015, as you may know, we have the head office here in Colombo, but we also have 10 regional offices around the country. So at the head office in 2015, we received 311 complaints. At the regional offices, we received 102. And this year, from January to March 2016, in total we have received 53 complaints. So when we receive a complaint, we usually undertake an inquiry, an investigation, conduct inquiries if necessary, and then if we do find that there is evidence and an act of torture has taken place, then what we do is we refer that to the Attorney General to take further action for prosecution, because as you may know, in Sri Lanka we also Sri Lanka has ratified the Convention Against Torture, and in order to implement that domestically, we have the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman or Degrading Treatment or Punishment Act of 1994. So we do have a piece of legislation that criminalizes torture. So if an official uses torture, then we can prosecute them. But unfortunately, what we have seen in Sri Lanka is that, and also the problem is that we don't actually have the exact statistics. So if you ask it depends on who you ask. People will give you different numbers. So I think at last count, I'm not sure entirely, but it was about 6. I think we had about 6 convictions and maybe about 13 prosecutions. That is since 1994. But once again, as I said, no one seems to have the exact statistics.
Right. What about the stigmatization of women, of men, when it comes to being a victim of torture? You're not really incentivized to report it.
Yes, I mean, you're not incentivized to report it for many reasons. It could also be, one is fear of the state structures. You're also afraid of reprisal. So if it is a state official who has tortured you, then you are afraid they could actually, perpetrate further violence against you. And then, of course, because I think what we find is that within the community, I mean, it would be very easy to only blame the police officer or other officials that perpetrate torture. But it is an undeniable fact that even within society, we find that there is a general acceptance of torture. So people would accept it if someone who is arrested is subjected to some form of force by the official concerned in order to extract information. People generally seem to think that it's okay. And for some it is
so we need to change public perception then.
Most definitely. So, if a person is a victim of torture, one of the reasons they may not wish to also come forward is that they will think, society thinks I'm a wrongdoer. It is only because I was arrested for some wrongdoing, then they used force on me. So that is also a reason, one of the reasons people might not come forward. So I think changing societal attitudes is extremely important, because when there is this acceptance of torture, it means there is also acceptance of violence, and that kind of violence, it impacts society at every level, because it is not merely the person who has been subjected to torture who might have PTSD, might have trauma, might not be able to sleep, might not be able to go to work, might have problems within the family, might then perpetrate violence within the family. It is also the perpetrator, because studies have clearly shown that perpetrators also are affected. They also suffer some form of psychological trauma, and that they also carry that with them into their home. So they might perpetrate violence or other forms of abuse within their private spheres as well. So torture is a kind of a virus that affects us all.
How do we go about ridding society of this menace? How do we go about changing public perception? As a Commissioner of the Human Rights Commission of Sri Lanka, how do you view this?
I think it has to be a multi-pronged approach, most definitely. So we do have the law, as it were, but we do need to also strengthen implementation. That is extremely important. We also need to have public awareness campaigns. We need to provide incentives and support to victims to come forward, because what we have now, for instance, is, as you know, in Sri Lanka, psychosocial care is very limited. So we have very few psychiatrists. So for instance, if you're a person who is living outside of Colombo, and if you have suffered torture and due to that psychological trauma, it will be very difficult for you to access psychosocial care. So therefore, I think it is very important to also provide that kind of support to victims. So I think it is in a way legal, it is social, it is medical, and also the other thing is, it's very important, I think, to provide training to police in interrogation methods, because right now torture is viewed as a normal method of interrogation. Sometimes it's the only method of interrogation that they know. So I think it's important to train them on interrogation techniques and also strengthen our forensics. Because, I mean, in many countries, you would have seen, like in the US, in the past 12 months, we have seen a number of persons who have been convicted for crimes being released after 23 years, after 36 years, because forensics has actually found that they didn't commit the crime in the first place. So I think we need to strengthen our forensic capacities, and also our judicial medical officers. We definitely need more of them, and also to sensitize them to torture and its impact.
These are all excellent recommendations. How has the Human Rights Commission of Sri Lanka contributed in this process?
Yes, well, or how do we also hope to contribute in the future? I think the Human Rights Commission, as I said, we accept complaints of torture. We inquire into them. We also provide, and we hope to in the future provide awareness, undertake awareness raising campaigns, provide training.
Can we have a timeline?
Timeline. Well, our term is 3 years, so one would hope that within those 3 years we would, manage to at least fulfill some of that.
Yeah.
If not,
of these 3 years, how many years have gone by now?
8 months.
8 months.
8 months. Yeah, 8 months have gone by.
All right.
So, we're training for state officials, and most importantly, also contribute to because one of our powers, our mandate, is in an advisory capacity.
Sure.
To provide advice to the government on ways in which they can actually eradicate torture. So that could even be related to legal reform, because we have on our statute book certain laws that create conditions conducive to torture, and in some ways even encourage torture. So one of that, for example, is the Prevention of Terrorism Act.
Sure.
Because that allows for prolonged detention without being produced before a magistrate. Which means, then there is room for abuse. The Prevention of Terrorism Act also allows confessions made to an SSP or someone of a higher ASP or someone of a higher rank to be submitted as evidence. So we have seen a number of cases where the only piece of evidence there might be the confession. There are no productions, as they call them. So therefore, the Prevention of Terrorism Act is a piece of legislation that actually creates conditions conducive to torture. So what the Human Rights Commission has done in relation to the PTA is we've done two things. One is recently we have issued directives on how arrests and detention should take place under the PTA. Now, these guidelines are based on international human rights norms and standards.
Are these directives accessible online?
They are all available on our website. They are definitely accessible on our website.
Since right to information is
it's all there. We try to be as transparent as possible. So then we were very fortunate because the president then 2 weeks later he actually reissued the guidelines as presidential guidelines, and in that he explicitly states that his intent in issuing them is to enable the work of the Human Rights Commission to protect and promote the rights of citizens. So we've done that, and also about a week ago we released a statement welcoming the president's directives, and at the same time also reiterating that the PTA should be repealed, and also setting out various factors that they need to include in any new national security legislation that is drafted.
All right. We are in conversation with Ms. Ambika Satkunanathan, Commissioner of the Human Rights Commission of Sri Lanka. The Prevention of Terrorism Act has come under much discussion, controversy. It has been called by some as a draconian piece of legislation that must go. We'll talk a bit more about the PTA right after this short commercial break. We'll be back.
Newsfirst Newsline with Faraz Shaukdali.
Hello there and welcome back. This is Newsline. We're in conversation with one of the commissioners of the Human Rights Commission of Sri Lanka, Ms. Ambika Satkunanathan. Before the break, we were talking about the Prevention of Terrorism Act. It has been referred to as a draconian piece of legislation. For people watching us at home, can you detail to us, Ms. Satkunanathan, what are the major areas of the PTA that we should be wary of?
Well, actually, where the PTA is concerned, pretty much all provisions you should be wary of, because what the PTA enables, as I mentioned earlier, is it enables prolonged detention without judicial review. So what that means is, for instance, and it allows for administrative detention. So what that means, in simple language, is under the PTA, anyone can be arrested on a detention order that is issued by the Minister of Defence, and that detention order can be extended every every 3 months up to 18 months. And so a person can be in detention for 18 months without actually even being produced before a magistrate. So this creates conditions conducive for torture, because during this period the person most likely will not also have access to a lawyer, and having access to a lawyer, having access to family members, being produced before a magistrate, so all ways in which you actually prevent torture, because people can see, speak with you, obtain information, review the detention, etc. Then another very problematic provision, as I mentioned, is confessions. Because usually confessions, and this is not in relation to Sri Lanka, we've even seen this in many other contexts where confessions are extracted through torture. Now, according to Sri Lankan law, any confession that is extracted through such use of force is actually not admissible in court, except, of course, according to the PTA, where if you make such a confession to a police officer, an ASP or above of rank, then of course that is admissible as evidence. Now, we have come across a number of cases under the PTA where you find a person has been convicted, and this is for many years, based only on a confession. So how reliable is that? Because the confession could have been obtained through force, and so you do need other evidence to support the conviction. So therefore those are two very problematic provisions, because it doesn't allow adequate oversight to ensure that violations do not take place.
All right. Earlier on in the conversation, we spoke also about torture, the definition of it, to which you said that it is defined as torture if it happens at by a
That's
government
right. That has
official.
one of the elements. Yes.
Exactly.
Yes.
But what of the torture that happens within the home, in the private domain?
Yes. The violence.
The violence.
Yes.
The domestic abuse.
Yes.
This doesn't come under the definition of torture, does it?
Well, what has happened is we have seen even the human rights discourse and jurisprudence at the international level has actually progressed. So what we, for instance, recently the Special Rapporteur on Torture, Juan Mendez, he actually talked about the gendered aspects of torture. There's a report that he released a few months ago. So something that he reiterates in that is, because the official element is not involved, that, it could be said that the violence that takes place within the private sphere is not torture. But if the state, the government in question, if the state does not take required action to prevent that, does not provide adequate remedies to those affected, then that could constitute torture. So that is actually quite progressive, because we have seen at the international level, human rights jurisprudence has developed. So for instance, if you take now, we say it's torture and other cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment. So the question can be, what is the difference between this, right? And it is actually a bit difficult to differentiate between them. So for instance, it might be easier to differentiate between degrading treatment and cruel, inhuman treatment or torture. But what the Special Rapporteur has also said is that we would find perhaps, because the jurisprudence is developing, in the future, something that was degrading treatment, where you look at the intensity of the treatment, that might be considered torture, because human rights standards are evolving and our standards are becoming higher. So what was considered degrading might actually be considered in the future cruel, inhuman or treatment or torture.
Right. Also, let's talk a bit about the psychological abuse that happens within the home. This is not really recognized or given importance to, but psychological abuse is something that can scar a person for life.
Where psychological abuse is concerned, now if you take torture, custodial torture, there too it does not necessarily have to be physical. So for instance, something like sensory deprivation can amount to torture. Something like solitary confinement could amount to torture. Now, where the private sphere is of course concerned, you talked about the psychological impact. So if we take, let's say, as an example, domestic violence, in Sri Lanka we have the Prevention of Domestic Violence Act. Now that of course doesn't criminalize domestic violence, but it allows those subjected to domestic violence to go to court and ask for what's called a protection order.
Right.
So the protection order would then prevent the perpetrator from being within your vicinity, from if you share a home, then they will actually ask the person to leave the home. So it affords some sort of protection. So in that act, they also recognize psychological violence. It's not merely physical. So in that sense, there has been some progress where, even in the private sphere, we do accept that violence doesn't necessarily have to be physical. It can also be psychological.
Do you think the Sri Lankan police is proactive enough or has sufficient enough training to deal with victims of violence, victims of abuse who come to them for assistance?
Well, I think more training is required, more sensitization is required, and also more resources, because I think even the police is under-resourced. They are also, I think, understaffed. They don't have enough cadre. And we need more women police officers. And we need to better equip the women and children's desks. So I think there are a number of ways in which we do need to increase and strengthen the capacity. And as I said before, interrogation techniques. We need to strengthen that as well. So yeah, many things that need to be done.
All right. Let's also talk a bit about the death penalty. Does this constitute torture? Does this come within the definition, Ambika?
It can, because once again, if you look at international human rights discourse and jurisprudence, now it has been accepted that if it does cause severe pain and suffering, then it can constitute torture. So for instance, in cases where persons are on death row for 10-20 years, in cases where executions, as we've seen, it's happened also in certain countries where the executions in the United States, executions have been botched, and that has caused severe pain and suffering to the person who they've about to be executed. And so in those cases, it has been recognized that that too can constitute torture. So where the Human Rights Commission is concerned, what we did is on the 1st of January this year, we wrote to His Excellency the President calling for the abolition of the death penalty. And we also asked Sri Lanka to ratify the second optional protocol to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which actually is on the abolition of the death penalty. And the reasons that we put forward for the abolition of the death penalty is that once again there is this misconception that if you have the death penalty, then you can lower the rate of crime, which is not true, because research has shown this is really not the case. Then it is assumed that it is that it acts as a deterrent, but it doesn't. And also in many cases, the death penalty is based on an assumption that our judicial systems are perfect, that no one makes mistakes, that all the evidence is untainted, whereas that is not the case. So what happens if there is a mistake? Does that mean that the man loses his life? And as I mentioned, in the United States, we've seen over the past 12 months a number of persons who've been incarcerated for 20 and even 36 years, I think the last time, were actually acquitted. I mean, they were set free because of forensics, which 26 years later found he didn't actually commit the crime.
Miscarriages of justice.
And also, most often you find it is those who are poor, who are marginalized, who also are on death row because they cannot afford proper legal representation. And for all those reasons, we actually recommended to His Excellency the President that in Sri Lanka we need to abolish the death penalty.
Right. Ambika, I'd also like to talk about what happens to victims of torture, victims of abuse. What are the ways in which they can seek redress, they can seek assistance and help? Because the system in Sri Lanka isn't very conducive towards psychosocial support. I mean, we've seen this when it comes to the post-war situation. The psychosocial element, counseling, has been at a very low level. Your thoughts on that?
Yes. How can they seek support? And I agree that the psychological impact can be severe. It can affect not only the individual but also the family, because people can also, there have been cases where they've been unable to go back to work. So that impacts the family, the livelihood, the children. And of course, in Sri Lanka, psychosocial support is very limited. And this is something we do need to increase, because I think particularly in the state sector, you find that support is very limited. And if at all, you find a lot of non-governmental organizations providing this kind of support. So I think it is an area that we do really need to pay a lot of attention to, because if you're talking about helping these victims rebuild their lives, psychosocial support is an integral part of it.
And something that we are lacking in our system.
Definitely lacking. Definitely. Most definitely lacking. Because I think, I can't remember the number, but I think the total number of psychiatrists in Sri Lanka, it is actually, I think if I'm not mistaken, under 20. Or it is actually, it's a quite a small number, and most of them tend to be based at urban hospitals. So what about the rural hospitals? So we need to increase people's access to psychosocial care.
The Constitution of Sri Lanka may be subjected to reform. As the Human Rights Commission, what are your recommendations?
We've actually, it's good that you asked me that question, because we made a representation to the Public Representations Committee. And one of the things that we've asked for is that the non-discrimination clause be widened to include even things like sexual orientation, sexual identity. Then we've also made a number of recommendations related to the declaration of states of emergencies. Once again, very important where torture is concerned, because that is also when a state of emergency is declared, it gives extensive unchecked powers to certain officials like the police, the military, etc. So we've called for various measures to be put in place to actually subject the state of emergency to judicial review. So for instance, if the state of emergency extends for more than 6 months, then you need to have a 2/3 vote in Parliament to support its continuation.
All right. Thanks very much. Ambika Satkunanathan, Commissioner of the Human Rights Commission of Sri Lanka, joining us on this edition of Newsline. Thanks very much for a very informative session, Ambika.
Thank you, Sonali.
And with that, we wrap up this edition of Newsline. We'll see you again, same time, same place, next Monday.
Newsfirst Newsline with Faraz Shaukatali.